So the first thing we did when we began considering moving the Playhouse was to find out if it could be moved on a truck. And so a trucking company was contacted, and they said yes, it was a slightly oversized load, but it could be moved. And certain things would have to be done to the Playhouse to make sure it was sturdy enough to survive the move without being shaken to pieces or have its windows blown out or lose a lot of shingles bouncing along the highway on the back of a semi going 65 miles an hour. So to begin the moving of the Playhouse, once we had a crane operator and a trucker secured, we hired a carpenter. The one who helped us with this move was named Rick Anderson. Rick came out the evening before the truck was to arrive and first built a beam that extended from one end of the Playhouse to the other, going through the windows. Exactly the same design that had been used when it was moved across the street. This beam was heavy and was made out of 2x12s and was anchored so that it couldn't slide either way through the Playhouse. My son Christian and I moved the Playhouse porch away as the carpenter, Rick, cut through the pillars with a sawzall. After the pillars had been cut off with a sawzall, my son Christian and I were able to pull the Playhouse porch away from it. Then we had to take off the decking that was sort of forming a foundation around the base of the Playhouse. Now that turned out to be a lot of work. It was night by the time we were working on it. We did have a come-along, and with the help of the crowbar and a come-along fastened to a tree, we pulled the skirting away and found that the Playhouse was sitting on concrete pilings, but that basically it wasn't anchored to the ground. The next morning, even before it was light, we looked out and there was Rick Anderson with a work light going, and he was reinforcing some things, making sure that the Playhouse was loose and that things were reinforced enough to be able to lift. Just as the sun was rising, Ryan O'Donnell of O'Donnell Crane came with his big crane, and we had had a couple other crane operators consider the project, but the original one that had moved it across the street and another one could not move it because a tree had grown so large in the 6 years that it had been at my mom's second house that a much larger crane was needed to lift it over the tree and also over the power lines to get it to the driveway where this large truck, a semi-truck from rail transport, would be pulling in. So the crane showed up at about daybreak, and Ryan pulled the crane into position. Rick went around, made sure that the Playhouse was ready for the lift. My son Christian and I were going around coordinating everything, and at about 7:40 that next morning, the truck from rail transport showed up. After thinning some branches along the driveway, the rail truck was able to come in without its cab getting scratched. And Ryan O'Donnell lowered the crane's cable. The cable had straps attached to the end, and the straps were placed around the ends of the beam. We're running around making sure that the straps are not going to damage the roof, and that the beam is going to pull straight up and the Playhouse is not going to tip over when it's lifted. Well, we began lifting, and all of a sudden it turned out that part of the skirting that we left on, thinking it was a foundation, started to fall off. So Rick, the carpenter, went around and reinforced the skirting because we were going to need that at the end. That was going to form sort of the base, the new foundation, once we got it up to the cabin at Eagle River. So after lifting it a foot or two and making sure that the skirting was reinforced, the lift proceeded. The Playhouse was lifted so high in the air, it looked like Dorothy's house in The Wizard of Oz, way up in the air. It was even similar in its architecture. And the Playhouse was even similar to Dorothy's house in Kansas in its age and vintage. It looked very much like the house in The Wizard of Oz that was picked up by the tornado. Well, the house had to be lifted about 35 feet in the air to get it over this tree, this maple tree that had grown, and also over the power wires. It was successfully lifted, And then it was lowered down into the driveway where the trucker, John from Rail Transport, and my son Christian and I and Rick all made sure that the Playhouse ended up straight on the back of this lowboy semi. It needed to be on a lowboy because some of the bridges that would be going under had just enough clearance for that 8-foot Playhouse to fit under these overpasses. So with all of us working on it, we got it safely down onto the lowboy, and the truck pulled out into the street onto Linden Avenue, and the trucker secured the Playhouse to the trailer using straps, strapping the beams down to the lowboy bed, and placing what's called a steel tarp over the entire little house so that debris wouldn't break that front window, and that the shingles could hold up to the force of the wind going 65 miles an hour. Now, we were worried that after all this trouble and expense, the Playhouse might not survive the highway part of it. That's why we really reinforced that Playhouse porch, and then once it was on the truck, the driver also secured the porch by placing straps that wrapped over the roof and down to the opposite side of the trailer. And then a tarpaulin was put over the whole thing just to make sure that there wouldn't be wind and debris damage to either the windows or the roof. We said goodbye to the Playhouse, and it drove off around the bend, and Christian and I were left to reclaim the site. The Playhouse was now on its way to Eagle River, Wisconsin. Now, we noticed that once the Playhouse was gone, there was a divot. The ground had been sort of hollowed out, and the Playhouse foundation, made out of wood, had been backfilled. Well, now what we had looked like a little volcano. It was a crater of dirt surrounded by grass. Well, we had bought sod, but the sod wouldn't be enough because it would still dip down and there'd probably be a puddle there, and people would wonder what this little crater is doing in the yard. After a couple phone calls, we found a place in a town called Malta, about 8 miles from DeKalb, that had some dirt available on a Saturday afternoon. And the fellow said if we could be out there in 20 minutes, he'd sell us some dirt. Once we got this good black dirt back to the Playhouse, we still had to demolish the concrete pilings. Christian started to work on the pilings and realized how hard they were. Chips were flying everywhere. We had to put plywood up against my car, which still had this trailer full of dirt parked behind it, so that flying pieces of concrete wouldn't scratch my car or break a car window. Earlier in the day, we had gone to Farm and Fleet to buy a cold chisel because we thought that might be better at chiseling away at these 6 concrete footings that the Playhouse sat on. We decided that the chisel wasn't a very effective way, and Christian just proceeded to bash away at these concrete pilings with the maul. It took over an hour, but eventually all of the pilings were smashed down enough so that we could begin filling the crater with the black dirt we had brought down from Malta. We raked the black dirt right over the pieces of debris from the pilings, and pretty soon the ground was almost level. After we had raked out the black dirt nearly level, we took the sod, placed the sod in, and we had just enough. The sod covered all of the area of the Playhouse, including where the porch had been. The reclamation looked pretty good. The sod was sort of in a T shape, and there were some areas behind where the Playhouse had sat where it was so shady that the grass didn't grow very well. After Christian and I packed up, we headed back to Marshfield, Wisconsin.